very lucky experience as a young graduate student at the University of Illinois, looking at Susie Hanner, who I first met there. I was in a doctoral program on a teaching research lab, and I went to psych classes that were really silly. And I said to another of my colleagues there, Jessica Daniels, who later became the first black president for American Psychology Association, I said, Jessica, this is crazy. She says, you know what you might be interested in? This guy over at the Colonel Wolfe preschool. You might find that kind of valuable, since the rest of it was kind of silly. And I went over to just meet Zig Engelman, Carl Breiter, and I thought, I haven't been in a preschool since I was in preschool, so I'll just look around. It wasn't what I went there. I went to study secondary language acquisition. I wasn't really a high school teacher. So I'm looking around, and the janitor comes in, and I'm all alone, and this guy is really big, and he has really big muscles. And he's wearing a black T-shirt with his cigarettes there, and I'm thinking, yes, and then he starts talking and asking me questions like, who is this guy? And I'm quietly oozing toward the back, to the door. It's quite late, thinking, I need to get out of here. And then I finally said, why are you asking me questions? Who are you? He said, I'm Zig. Oh, what an exciting discovery. A guy who would influence the rest of my life, no question about it. I did my dissertation years later and found that Zig in the 60s had identified all the critical elements of reading, the science of reading, that were verified by the National Reading Panel many years later. He'd done them all, you know, phonemic awareness. Nobody even knew about phonemic awareness. That was something we started out with, the phonics, the fluency, the vocabulary. Everything was there. He had it, he understood it, and he did it efficiently. And he got data and evidence that it worked. Years later, I want to say that if you haven't had a chance to look at it, all of this has been verified, and I think a very important book by Jean Stockert and her team that took all of the data that we have on direct instruction and consolidated in meta-analyses. There isn't anything out there that verifies how incredibly effective all of the DI curriculum is and the amazing delivery that the teacher training has provided. The titans in this room who are just changing the world, the amazing community we live in. I recommend, if you haven't read it, get it. It's really worth it. Not a page turner like a lot of Shep's books, not as fun, but the evidence is really here. And hey, we're lucky to be here.
Part of my activities in the 1990s was to visit community groups that wanted to improve the education of poor kids in their communities. At first, I wanted just to present general ideas about reading instruction, but they had heard about Wesley School in Houston, Texas, and they said, and when they went to the school districts would say, no, if it's so good, how come nobody uses it? So we went down to Houston, and we got to see a school in which there were 10 kindergarten classes, and every kid could read. And then over the years, we went to Baltimore, we went to Columbus, Ohio. We got to see schools that worked, and in spite of all the stuff that was against DI, people who went to those schools, the community people, came back and DI got started. But it was because of schools that really produced well. And now it's so good to hear about Baltimore and other places that are doing it. And I think now, with the work Doug's doing and with that podcast, sold the story, and there are openings again to get DI in, and do a great job, continuing doing a great job. Those good schools, when we bring people there, they have such an influence. You know. So I'm going to pass it on to Geoff now. That's my one statement.
I think I'd like to stand. I can see who's not listening. It's all supervisory behavior. I hope you can understand me. I've been talking to some Australians, and I've had a refresher course. I was born and raised there, of course. Lovely to see them too. The little piece I'm adding, I'd like to say it's not an add-on. It's not. It should be something seamless, and it is. I don't know whether you notice in the conference there's always a strand on behaviour, and then because kids misbehave, you can still teach well, but they'll misbehave as though something's separate. Now, back in the 1980s, the late 80s, 3 of us wrote a grant because we were concerned with the number of suspensions and expulsions around the country. And it became very clear that the basic management was in the schools, and we checked this out for the grant. Here are the rules, here are the consequences. And because the ultimate consequence was to be expelled, and kids would get on that track and so on. So our grant was to address that problem. But you won't get funded unless you got a strategy to answer those questions. What can we do to keep kids in school? And we came up with a model. And that model, guess what? Direct instruction. We looked closely at the way Zig analyzed instruction and then applied that to behavior. And Zig would say things like, you want kids to behave, you have to teach them. You want them to walk in the hallways, you have to have them practice it, reminders of it, catch them walking, all those kinds of things. But he made us focus on teaching behavior. So what's involved with teaching behavior? That's not a new science. We only have to look at what goes on in DI, and we use those same principles. For example, someone says, why does this kid do this? And I like to say, that's not a really good question. A good question is, why do they keep doing it? And then that makes them look at learning. They've learned to behave this way. So why can't we have them learn to behave that way? So that was the model. And we had lots of parallels between how to teach academic skills with behavior. And we got funded. And we implemented that grant in 4 schools here in Eugene area. And it was called Project Prepare. And the first word in that is proactive, and that was to capture that notion of teaching behavior. And I've never forgotten a statement Zig made to me once, because he was talking to me about me, because he was calling me a behaviorist. And he said, the trouble with behaviorists, they have to have a student response. He said, I can tell you what kids are going to do just by what's presented to them. And there's DI in a nutshell. You're arranging what's presented, and then you work with the kids' responses. But behaviorists work with the responses. So I had to change my MO just to maintain a friendship. But that grant was for 5 years, and since then there's been several iterations of it. It became EBS and PBS. You have to keep changing the name, otherwise you won't get the funding. So it's got to look new, but really it was the same model carried through. And right now, in the United States, the whole 50 states have some aspect of PBIS, which again is based on DI, how to approach behavior. So 50 states, I got the numbers here, I just got it last week, in 2,500 schools, 25,000 schools, right? And 35 countries. So it went from 4 schools to that size. And again, I'm here talking because it's a DI conference, and I want to be able to say loudly and clearly that behavior is part of the skills that kids need, and they need to be taught the same ways as we teach reading, writing, math, and spelling. So I guess I'm done if you've clapped already. But one last thing, Doug. 50 years, I read an article several years ago that was titled, I didn't read much more because it annoyed me, School Reform Again and Again. How many of us have seen endless changes in schools everywhere? But here we are celebrating 50 years of DI. It's changed a bit, but the substance hasn't changed. Isn't it comforting to have something that's stable? And why is it stable? Because it works. So thank you for being here.
It's always a mistake to save the driest presenter for last. So Jerry mentioned Wesley Elementary. So I was there about 45 years ago. I was sitting in the back of Miss Killian's room with 5th graders. They were accelerated out of Wesley, the highest performers across all the 5th grades. And the kids were so smart and so articulate and so engaged that the hair stood up on the back of my neck. And later those kids went on a tour of Baylor Medical School, and they had to bring a resident down because the questions they asked were so smart. The tour guide at the Baylor Medical School couldn't answer them. So that cuts 2 ways. One, it's very disturbing because when you realize that those kids can achieve at that level and they don't, we realize that every year we're miseducating hundreds of thousands of children. And it showed that DI can work. So you've got both sides of the sword, so to speak. So anyway, another thing I learned from DI was the opportunity to work with some of the finest people in the world. So I want to show you this T-shirt. Well, if I stand up, Sovo for mayor. That's Casey Sovo, when he was running for mayor in North Dakota. So he's one of the wonderful, wonderful people all of us have had the opportunity to work with because we all share integrity, we have a common language, we have a common purpose, and for that we should all be very grateful. So I was trained as an experimental psychologist and assumed that that evidence mattered. And through the DI experience and follow-through, I learned that education does not use evidence. So then I switched my career. I spent the next 15 years advocating for the use of evidence in education. And that effort was largely a failure, even though I had a presidential appointment and worked intensively in successful initiatives in Texas and California. I have a Texas Glass Star embossed with the words, founding father of the Texas Reading Initiative, Doug Carnine, thank you. In California, I worked with David Packard, and he ultimately donated $81 million to the Reading Alliance Project, which drove the professional development in the California Reading Initiative. So I became disheartened, and I left education. And instead, I started thinking about how could I heal some of the damage caused by miseducation. So we see that in incarcerated individuals, in students in alternative high schools, addiction treatment centers, and other special programs. So after reading the research on mindfulness and kindness, I decided to help these individuals by focusing on mindful kindness. Now, kindness is kind of obvious, but you need mindfulness so you quit obsessing about yourself and start paying attention to how other people are doing. And in fact, if you do that, it really benefits you as an individual. So I ran 2 different volunteer mindful kindness programs, and then a few years ago, Linda and I reaped the rewards of an exceedingly speculative startup investment, and we're able to actually fund the Kindness Foundation, which has, for example, provided funds for kindness programs in low-income, high-minority schools that's touched the lives of almost 800,000 students across the United States. The changes we've seen with incarcerated individuals are also quite amazing. The way it changes their lives. I was in a prison in Oregon where a man walked up to me and told me, he said, "Your book saved my life." So why am I back in education? Because of Mississippi's use of evidence to make staggering gains in NAEP reading scores, referred to as the Mississippi Miracle, and because of the articles about the misteaching of reading by Emily Hanford in her podcast and in the New York Times. I firmly believe that social change does not happen unless there is a historic moment where the public is engaged and sees the need for change. I thought that possibly the Mississippi Miracle and Emily Hanford's article created that historic moment. Consequently, about 9 months ago, Reed Lyon, who oversaw the world's largest research program on literacy, Kelly Butler, who was CEO of the Barksdale Institute that funded $100 million that drove the Mississippi Miracle, Linda Diamond, who was the founder of Core Learning, one of the most effective implementation companies along with DEI in the United States, and we decided to dramatically transform the education system and launch the Evidence Advocacy Center. For those of you who are interested, I have a handout that gives the web address and a brief description of the Evidence Advocacy Center and of the Kindness Foundation. It also has information about books I've written related to mindful kindness. And here's where DI comes in again. I could not have written any of these books about social emotional wellness, and we emphasize building community by teaching prisoners and kids at risk to be kindness ambassadors. How do you reach out to people different than you? And that's the greatest need we have in our society today, that we do not reach out to those who are different. We become more insular. Our groups are more and more hostile and unlistening. So we're feeling that if we can teach the least, as seen in the eyes of our society, those in jail, and those who are poor, and those who, if they can do this, then why can't the larger society do that? But it was the DI instructional design skills that allowed me to write the books. But what I found was so interesting was, in DI, I was focusing only on cognitive content. And with these books, you have to not touch the mind, you have to touch the heart. And it requires a very different kind of instructional design. So, this is St. Badass, Personal Transcendence in Tucker Max Hell. About 90% of this book is by 4 men who were convicted of the most horrible crimes you can imagine, I mean that, and how their lives transformed. And then we have the Mindful Kindness program. This book is used only in prison settings, but they're all around teaching mindful kindness, how to heal yourself, how to heal your relationships, and how to reach outside your comfort zone. Lasting Happiness, a guide for teens and young adults, is teaching these skills to younger people. And then we also have an adult version, How Love Wins. But the idea is that if you think about a child, the things that are most important are what happens in school and what happens in family and how they're treated. And one of the beauties of direct instruction is it inspires and empowers teachers to bring about success that warms the heart of the child and of the teacher. So we're able to bring these together in a very powerful way, a very important way. So all of us are fortunate to be in a profession where we can make a difference for children and educators. We're changing lives now. We will change lives in the future. But what I'm doing is trying to change the system. Now, Shep Barbash had a great metaphor. He said, what happens with a fast horse on a sloppy track? Well, the fast horse is DI, and the sloppy track is the U.S. education system. And it's definitely impeding what we can and need to do. So anyway, it's inspiring to be here and listening to these awards. That's why we're here. Everyone who's doing amazing things, we're lucky to be together. We have a sense of belonging, we have a community, and so I appreciate being with a group committed to making a difference. So thank you.